Today, we welcome to Global Citizenship Education Interview Series Pedro Noguera. Pedro Noguera is the Emery Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean of the University of Southern California, USC, Rossier School of Education. A sociologist, Noguera's research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global context. He's the author, co-author, and editor of 13 books. His most recent books are The Crisis of Connection, Roots, Consequences, and Solutions with Nobel Way, Carol Gilligan and Alisha Lee, New York University Press, 2018, and Race, Equity, and Education, 60 Years from Brown with Gilly Pierce and Roey Ahram, Springer, 2015. He has published over 250 research articles in academic journals, book chapters and edited volumes, research reports and editorials in major newspapers. He serves on the boards of numerous national and local organizations, including the Economic Policy Institute, the National Equity Project, and The Nation. Noguera appears as a regular commentator on educational issues on several national media outlets, and his editorials on educational issues have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Dallas Morning News, and Los Angeles Times. Noguera was recently appointed to serve as a special advisor to the governor of New Mexico on educational policy, and he has received 7 honorary doctorates from American universities, and he recently received awards from the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, from the National Association of Secondary School Principals, and from the Max Silver Institute for Poverty, Policy, and Research at New York University for his research and advocacy efforts aimed at fighting poverty. So, Pedro, first of all, I believe that I should ask you, how are you and how is going in the States at the moment? And also, and most importantly, I want to thank you for joining the interview series on global citizenship education.
Thank you, Emiliano, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm well. The United States is not well. It's in the middle of a political crisis created by 2 parties that are have chosen octogenarians as their candidates, and neither of whom seems capable of addressing the big problems facing the country and also facing the world. So, although I could say I'm fine, the country's not fine.
Right. And all my guests here would go through a first straightforward question. And the question is, considering in your specific case, your excellent and I would add precious work on race, equity, and education, how can a commitment to equity and inclusivity contribute to the cultivation of global citizenship? And how would you define global citizenship?
So when I think of global citizenship, it's a fundamental recognition of the human rights of all persons, regardless of the nation they are part of. It's a recognition that human beings, regardless of race or status or gender or sexual orientation, all have basic inalienable rights, and those rights must be acknowledged, recognized, and supported. So when we think about global education, we think about how to cultivate all kinds of people, developing their talents and skills so they can contribute to the betterment of the world. And that's the reason why education is so critical to creating a true global citizen.
Right. And in preparing for this video interview with you, I went through a lot of your publications, books, and I want to focus, at least for this first part of our conversation, on one of your recent books, The Crisis of Connection, which I've read with pleasure. And within this book, you suggest that since the beginning of the 21st century, people have become increasingly disconnected from themselves, each other, and the world around them. And herewith, you define this as a crisis of connection stemming from growing alienation, social isolation, and fragmentation characterizing our modern society. So the question is, how can addressing this crisis, again, you define this a crisis of connection, so how can addressing this crisis contribute to the development of a more connected, compassionate, and just society? And what role does global citizenship play in building meaningful connections, if at all?
Yeah. So the idea behind a crisis of connection is not new. It's something that social scientists have spoken about for many years. Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist, called it anomie, a state of normlessness in society when, as society becomes more industrial and the bonds that connect people weaken because they're no longer connected by religion or by geography. Increasingly, you see increased alienation and a sense of normlessness. What we now see is that that also produces a crisis of empathy, an inability to identify with individuals who might be of a different nationality, different race, different live in a different part of the world when they're experiencing a crisis. So we think about the global migration crisis that's occurring throughout the world, where millions of people are forced to leave their homes because of the need to survive. They try to get to wealthier nations, and increasingly the only response is to keep them out. And even if keeping them out means we're dooming many of them to an early death, a death at sea, a death in the desert, in the case of the US, because they're not seen as our people, they're not seen as part of the human family, they are seen as expendable. We see the same kind of process occurring, a dehumanization occurring in the United States when there are mass shootings. We had a mass shooting in Iowa, one of the states here in the US, just last week. Yeah. If that shooting had been carried out by terrorists from Iran or from some other country, there would have been a great response across the US that we're under attack. But the attack was carried out by a 17-year-old who had a gun and who was unstable, who shot up his school and killed several classmates. And that is increasingly seen as normal and acceptable. In fact, the response of policymakers in Iowa and nationally was, move on, get over it. And it's that way in which we have come to tolerate suffering, tolerate the mass death, tolerate injuries to others because we don't believe they are part of us, part of our family, part of we're not connected to them. That's why it's a crisis of connection. We feel if it were a member of our family, if it were a member of our tribe, we might respond differently. But when the suffering besets another group, it is more easily written off and dismissed. And that's happening on a larger and larger scale. And as the crisis of connection increases, our ability to mobilize a response to issues like migration or climate change or poverty or war is diminished because those who are safe don't believe that the problem is theirs.
And I want to ask you a couple of questions following up on this important concept that you are sharing here. The first question is, do you think that this crisis of connection is a specific characteristic of the United States, or is a more broad crisis, the crisis of connection characterizing other parts of the world as well?
It's a global problem. It's really a global problem. It's certainly present in the United States, it's present in Europe, but you see elements of it in all over the world. And what it does is it breeds an indifference, a tolerance for suffering, a sense that we are not responsible or interdependent, which is a fallacy. We are, in fact, interdependent. What happens in South Pacific, where they're dealing with climate change and rising seas, does affect us, or it will affect others elsewhere in the planet. But to the degree that we can think, well, that's not my problem, it's their problem, then we will dismiss it. So this crisis of connection is something that affects all of us. And it is really limiting the ability of the world to respond to the many challenges we face.
Definitely. And in this context, I'm interested about your point of view on what is the role of this discussion on global citizenship in, for instance, playing a role in building meaningful connections if, as you said, and I agree with you, there is indeed a crisis of connection. In simple words, this discussion on global citizenship can meaningfully contribute and help with this crisis of connection.
Well, but with the concept of global citizenship, and I think it is an important concept because what it does is it suggests that we are connected to each other, regardless of where we live, regardless of the nations we're part of. There's a human connection that transcends our boundaries and transcends our differences. But if that concept is not combined with a strategy to inculcate the concept, to teach it, to make it real, it will just be, a lofty idea embraced by a few academics, but not one that results in a change in the direction we're heading.
So, given your deep experience and long experience, do you see any possibility that the concept of global citizenship gets indeed implemented across higher education institutions, secondary and primary institutions? What is your navigating academia? What is your feeling about the current status of global citizenship education, global education?
I would say right now we are in trouble because what we've seen just in the last few years is a rise in nationalism. And we've seen it in the United States with the Trump movement, Make America Great, America First. But we've seen elements of it in China, in India, in Russia. We've seen elements of it in Brazil. This idea that every nation for itself. And that is a fallacy, but it is one that's taken hold in many countries. And it works against the concept of global citizenship. The idea of global citizenship is that there are fundamental rights that transcend the borders. And unfortunately, the borders have become more hardened, and this sense of global citizenship, I think, has taken a hit because of it.
It's getting increasingly complex. All right, now a question that I particularly like, and generally speaking, my guests also enjoy answering. And the question is about your personal journey and specifically how do notions of race, equity, and possibly global citizenship relate to your journey, first of all, as a human being, because we just discussed the importance of feeling connected to others, but also as an educator.
Yeah. Well, I am the son of immigrants. Both my parents are immigrants from the Caribbean, but I was raised in New York City, like many immigrants. New York is home. Fortunately for me, at a very early age, I got to travel. My father believed in the importance of travel. He himself had been a seaman, a merchant seaman, and had traveled the world many times. And he instilled in us a sense that we are not simply US citizens, that we were, in fact, citizens of the world. But he wanted to encourage us to go out and see the world. And I took that seriously very early on. And because I did, I embraced this idea that the boundaries that separate us are less relevant than our human connection. And so whether, it be me working in New Zealand or in Canada or in South Africa or in other parts of the world, over and over again, what I've seen is that many of the challenges facing, particularly the most vulnerable and marginalized people, are similar, regardless of the nation that they're in. And it is in those similarities and in the need to find solutions to the pressing problems facing, particularly, again, the most vulnerable people, that there's a basis for bridging the differences and developing a response that begins to move in the direction of global citizenship.
Very interesting. In connection to what you just said, and based, of course, on your personal journey, both as an educator, human being, and a contributor to important projects related to race equity, I want to ask you about forthcoming projects, particularly if you could discuss a couple of forthcoming projects and their broad relevance.
Yeah, I believe fundamentally in the principle of think globally, act locally. And the reason why that's important is because it's very hard to act globally, right? That is, if I'm concerned about what's happening in Gaza, and I am, or what's happening in some other part of the world, the fact that I'm in Los Angeles means there's little I can do from here to address that problem. However, right here in Los Angeles, there are people living on our streets, large numbers of homeless people, mentally ill people on our streets. They're suffering right around me. I can take actions locally that I believe, if everyone took that position, would have a positive effect on the world. So much of my work has been focused on how to use education as a resource for addressing some of the critical problems we face in the world. So to give you an example, we have large numbers of children in our schools here in Los Angeles who are homeless. Their parents don't have a home to live in. So the children are living in cars or living in shelters. Those children often don't do very well in school because they move a lot, and they have other needs that affect their ability to learn. What we've tried to do is to focus on what are those needs and what could public policy do to alleviate some of those needs. So those children are in a position to get an education. That means challenging the idea that education is only about, teaching skills. Education also has to be focused on health, on safety, on basic needs, because if basic needs aren't addressed, very hard for an individual to learn. And so acting locally and doing what I can to address these critical issues gives me the ability to not feel demoralized as I look at the huge problems we face. Because the best way to counter that feeling of demoralization is to do something, and to be a part of the solution and not just think about how bad it is.
Absolutely. In terms of books, publications, projects, is there anything you like to share or anything you're working on that is particularly important to you?
Well, I'm working on so many things. Right now, let me think. I wish I could say, there were an effort that would be easy for your listeners to join in on. Unfortunately, right now, the way they have been developing, it's engaging just a small number of people, but maybe in the near future, that'll be different and we could involve many others. But I'm doing what I can where I am to try to address large problems related to the disenfranchisement of significant populations. But I haven't yet thought about how to involve many others in that work.
I see. Okay, so before we get to a final question, and I can tell it's a challenging one, I want to ask you a prior question. The question is, do you think there is a crisis of values in higher education and education in general, critical values, ethical values?
I do. I think there's a pressure in education to prepare young people for the world as it is, right? For jobs, for positions in society. And the reason why that's a problem is what that does is it focuses on reproducing and recreating the status quo. The status quo is the problem. What we need is an education that encourages critical thinking, creativity, problem solving, so that the next generation is equipped to solve the problems they've inherited from previous generations. And that is, I think, the education dilemma we face right now. How do we do more of that kind of learning so that young people will be prepared and equipped to address the problems of the future?
What would be 2 or 3 essential core values that you would see as definitely important for learners today?
I think, well, empathy is one, and understanding our interdependence. I think also this idea of agency. And by agency, what I'm referring to is the innate human capacity to think critically about your circumstances, about your environment, and to take actions. We need agency, not just at an individual level, but as a collective level, because we cannot afford to accept things as they are. I get worried. I see a lot of the movies that have come out recently are focused on the apocalypse and about life after the apocalypse. And what concerns me about that is that generates a feeling that the apocalypse is inevitable. And that instead of that we can avert it, that we can stop it, we must just succumb to it. I think we need to challenge that kind of thinking.
That narrative.
To not accept suffering, not accept war, not accept the impoverishment of so much of the world's population.
Absolutely, absolutely. In connection to this, I want to ask you a final question. And the question is, I know it's a challenging one, but let's see. How would you define global citizenship education using 3 keywords, and why these 3 keywords?
I would define global citizenship education as being rooted in empathy, because it is when we are able to see other human beings as connected to us, as being our fellow humans, then we react differently to their needs. I would say that divergent thinking is another key element of global citizenship, because we need a new generation of individuals who think differently about the problems we face, who don't just accept things as they are. And I would say that global citizenship, when I think of that concept, I think that it's rooted in the notion of relevance, of taking stock of what's going on around us, treating the world as part of our curriculum, rather than avoiding it, embracing it, engaging, and taking actions that allow us to be relevant in creating a new world.
Interesting, interesting. Well, Pedro, I want to thank you for joining the Global Citizenship Education Interview Series. This was a very interesting conversation, really interesting themes, and the crisis of connection, the importance to feel sort of a empathy for others, your projects, and of course, you as a human being. You're an excellent and great human being. So thank you so much for joining this interview series.
Thank you, Emiliano. It was a pleasure to be with you.